Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Josselyn.
And I'm the Omega. In today's episode, we're talking about the creative and technical process of how we create the 3D art for our game, A Shot in the Dark. Now, let's get seedy.
We've received a lot of questions about how we create the 3D art and other questions about 3D art in adult visual novels, such as why you often see the same assets in multiple games, or I see lots of players talking or asking about how developers could speed up the art process. And I see a lot of misconceptions about that out there. So we figured we would just do one big episode all about how we create the 3D art for A Shot in the Dark and answer all those questions in the process.
So we use a software called DAZ Studio, which is a free 3D creation and rendering application. And it's honestly one of the best tools in the business for this actual setup, like adult visual novels. Essentially, you have these models and characters that are like dolls, and you have your doll houses, essentially, with the models, the environments. So honestly, it's also what you would expect from a free tool. There's bugs, it crashes randomly, it's very fickle, and but that's something you have to accept and understand by using the free software like that. Another aspect with it is that there's some version updates that are just highly recommended to not use, even though that they're a newer version. It's gonna break your system or break your flow. So these are things that you have to keep in mind if you're going to consider software like DAZ Studio.
Yeah, if you've played a 3D adult visual novel, you've seen DAZ art. It's pretty much what most 3D adult visual novels are made with. Some do use Honey Select, which is actually a game engine that you can use to make customized images. But because you do not own the copyright of the images that you make, it's not the best tool necessarily, especially if you plan to monetize your game. But with DAZ, when you buy the license, when you buy the assets in the asset store, you automatically get a license to use them for still renders and animations. So that's why it is the best tool in this industry, and it's why everybody uses it. It has a pretty quick ramp up time compared to a lot of other ways of making art. And while it is free and does have its issues, I definitely am of the opinion that there's no better tool for somebody that's trying to create a 3D adult visual novel. And of course, there's some people that obviously disagree that there's a few people that use either Blender or Unreal to make the still renders and animations for their games. But there's a reason why most people use DAZ, even though you'll see players complain about how all the games look the same, or, obviously people complain about the downsides that DAZ has. But I hope it becomes clear when we talk more about the actual process in comparison to how it would work in other programs. It'll become clear why this is the number one choice for most developers.
There's one other one, if you remember, I forget the exact name. It's like Kokaitsu.
Yeah, Kokaitsu is also Illusion, whatever they're called now.
Yeah.
Which is the same company as Honey Select. So
yeah.
They're the same company. So it's the same idea, which is that, it's technically a game, but you can make customized images and essentially take screenshots of them, but you don't own the copyright.
Right, so you can't monetize it.
Right, you're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Like I said, one of the biggest upsides to DAZ is that there is a third-party asset store that's run by DAZ, and there's also some third-party asset stores that are not run by DAZ, but where you can buy products that work in DAZ Studio. And so that's really what the big upside for it is that unlike with Blender or other programs where you can get a few free assets, but for the most part, you would have to be actually creating and sculpting the 3D assets yourself or paying for somebody else to do them. With DAZ, there's a really big store of assets that are already made, and they all work together. And so, again, you can have relatively quick ramp up time, especially if you're creating something where you can get most of the DAZ assets already in the DAZ store. Obviously, people do sometimes commission custom assets, but you can, do a really wide variety of things just with the assets that are in the store. And yes, there's a base model that comes with DAZ. It's called Genesis, and that's the base model for the humans. We use Genesis 8.1 because that's what was the newest thing when we started. There's now Genesis 9. But the problem with starting with the newest one is that there's not as many assets that work with it, because there's hair, there's clothes, there's body morphs, face morphs, all kinds of things that are used to adjust the model. And so with 9, you just don't have as big a variety of things. So I think it'll be a while. I know I've seen some new devs who are using 9, but there's not a big incentive for us, for example, to move to 9, because then the characters might look different or have different hair or clothes than they do with the earlier model. But choosing 8.1 was not hard because everything that worked with 8, which had been around for multiple years, also works with 8.1. 8.1 just had some additional things that 8 did not have, as far as like the face geometry and things like that, and better materials for the skins that had more skin detail detail and things like that. So it was a no-brainer for us to use 8.1, but I don't think, we definitely won't be moving to 9 at any point with A Shot in the Dark. And so in that Daz Studio asset store, again, you can buy models that you can use to morph the base model to look like that model. You can buy hairs, and they're kind of like wigs that go on their head. You can buy clothes. You can buy like makeup that layers over their skin. All the different things that you would need to make a customized person. One misconception I do see, though, is that developers are limited to the models that you can buy in the Daz store. And that is definitely not the case. You can, and even if you do buy models in the Daz store, you do not have to apply them 100% to the base model. So, typically the characters have different names like Noreen and Jade and whatever. When you're creating a model for the first time and you start with the base model and then you're morphing it from there, you can apply each of those models that you've purchased from the Daz store by 10% or 20%. Like there's a little slider. And then on top of that, Daz has a lot of native morphs, and you can purchase additional ones that allow you to morph the face. So to change the shape of the nose, change the shape of the eyes, change the face shape and change the shapes of the parts of the body and all kinds of things. So there's lots of ways that you can customize the base model that do not rely on the models that you can purchase in the Daz store. And for A Shot in the Dark, all of our models are definitely custom. Some of them have like 10 or 20% of a few base models to kind of get a baseline of what I was looking for. But I had real human references for all the characters that, I mostly had to do with custom morphs, like changing, the shape of their eyebrow, changing the shape of their nose, changing their cheek shape. And so I did that for all of our characters. And so that's why you can't purchase any of them in the Daz store. We definitely get questions about it. People want, I think to create fan art. So they ask us, what model did you use for the characters? And some of them don't have any base models in them whatsoever. So, and if they do, it's like I said, maybe they have 5 different ones at 10%, and then I like morphed them from there. So there's just really no way for somebody to get the same model unless they go through the same process that I did. And that's assuming that they have the same morphs that I did, which may or may not be true. So you aren't limited to just what's in the Daz store in that regard. But when it comes to things like hair, clothes, environments, which is what they call like the scenes, the sets for the rooms and the outdoor environments and things like that, props, all of that. Again, it's not that you can't make something new, but most people stick with what's in the Daz asset store just because, again, to make something new would be a lot of work and or a lot of money to commission it. And then those assets typically can't be customized very much. You can change the textures. And so that's what I try to do so that, for example, there's like one university asset that everybody uses. And there's a reason everybody uses it is because it's the only one. Nobody else has made one that is even halfway decent. And so everybody uses it. But a lot of people, you'll notice, try to change like the wall colors and the texture of the carpet and things like that to try to make it unique. So you have a little bit of customization in that regard. I typically will use like one environment for like a room, but then bring in like rooms often come with a bunch of furniture when you buy it, but I'll bring in furniture from different rooms in order to kind of mix it up. And I know that's what a lot of other developers do is that they start with some, something from the Daz store and then they kind of mix it up in order to make it look unique. But a lot of us are starting with the same base assets for sure.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say real quick, when you were talking about, the people who have asked you about the character models and such, some people have straight up asked, like when you told them they're custom, they straight up ask, oh, can I have the model?
Yeah.
And it's like, no.
No. And it isn't even that simple anyway. Like there is a way that you can save the models in which it like saves all the morphs and brings them with the model. But the reality is like from a licensing standpoint, if, whatever morphs I used, we purchased the license for those morphs. And Daz makes it very tricky to work with somebody else's scene because you have to have all the exact same morphs that they have and all the exact same textures that they have, which makes sense, right? Because when you purchase that license, you only purchase it for yourself and your game. So you really shouldn't be sharing those things around. So it also would not be in line with the license for us to share those characters and all their morphs with somebody else because they didn't purchase all those morphs. In theory, we could have them purchase all the same morphs that they used and all the same textures, etc., and then send them the character. But again, that's kind of our proprietary information. So we wouldn't do that. There's really no benefit to us, but it's definitely not as simple as just like sending them sending them a copy of the Sophie character and now they have her character, as we'll talk about when it comes to us sharing things for animations and renders.
Right. And then I also think that it, with what you're saying with all the customization, like there's a reason why you're customizing. That's a foot stomp moment, which is, there's the Daz models have been out for so long and they've proliferated the market because it is, in our opinion, one of the best tools. that you need to differentiate yourself in ways of customizing things. Otherwise, like if you're using the base models in your games, people are going to think you're lazy. Like, what are you doing? Like, at least add some sort of customization to stand out. And there's various ways that happens. So.
Yeah, I always do kind of have a question mark in my mind when I see somebody using like just literally a base model from Daz, because I'm like, do you not realize that you can apply them in percentages? Because even when I'm making like a brand new character, like kind of essentially like an extra for a scene, I still will typically take like a few different characters and do like 25% this one and 25% that one. And that way they don't look exactly like a character from any other game. So yeah, I always find that kind of interesting when developers, which is becoming more and more rare, as you said, people have to differentiate themselves. But when I see people using essentially like exactly like a base model from Daz, I do always kind of like scratch my head, because it's really not that hard not to do that. It almost requires no extra effort. So, and the other thing you can mix and match is the skin textures. So, I have a lot of characters where maybe, like I said, I started with 10% of a particular base model or whatever, but you're not obligated to use the skin texture that came with any particular model. You can apply the skin texture from any model to, any character. And I did a lot of experimentation with that as well. And since we started A Shot in the Dark, even better skin textures have come out. But I did the best that I could with what was available at the time when we started, which was, late 2021 is actually when we started making these. So that was, over 2 years ago now. And so, yes, things have gotten better, but I definitely played around with different skin textures to find ones that I felt were the best. And then we applied freckles over a lot of those. So that was a separate texture that we applied. So, definitely put a lot of care. It took me a month or two to create all of our characters. And that was one of the first things that I did. I didn't really know anything about Daz at that point. That was one of the first things I did in Daz. So obviously there's things that in hindsight now that I know more about how Daz works that I would maybe do slightly differently with the characters. But all in all, I wouldn't change a whole lot. Like, I'm happy with them, especially the vibe that we were going for, which was kind of more of like a realism vibe. I will say that though, now that we've just been doing this longer, I do not necessarily have a regret, but I do think that it would have been maybe more fun to make characters that were really stylized. So to make characters that didn't look like real people, just because, it would have been more along the lines maybe of Prince of Suburbia, like a more like 2D or cartoony feel. It would have just been something more novel. But it's a polarizing thing. People either like Daz or they don't like it. And they either like 2D or they don't like 2D. I mean, people don't typically have like wishy-washy feelings about these things. They usually feel strongly one way or the other. So, we picked a lane and we leaned into it, and that's fine. But I do think sometimes you can have more fun. I know that's something that we've talked about with Classy Lemon, who makes Project Passion, that, he definitely leaned into the more of like, there's a million Daz games out there and Daz has its limitations, but, you can make something novel by making really stylized characters. And, I definitely think that that's a valid way to go, because there are a lot of Daz games already out there.
And just one quick side note I wanted to put out there. You were talking about the Genesis models and how we use 8.1. There's another popular game out there that uses the full license of the character models, I think.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I think House Party uses Daz models too.
Yeah, it's a separate license.
With that full license. And then I think they started with or still have like Genesis 3 because of how old the game is at this point.
Yeah, and they're not going to change it at this point.
Yeah, but it's still cool to see like the Daz models in a fully like traversable environment.
Yeah.
In that they're actually moving around and you can move around as a Daz model.
Yeah, and that's a different license. If you use the models within Daz to make still renders and animations using the Daz software, or even if you import them into another software like Unreal or whatever in order to make still renders and animations that are pre-rendered, then that's a particular license, which is cheaper, and that's the license most developers have. If you do want to import them into Unreal or something like this in order to make a game where, yes, the characters are rendering and moving in real time and controllable by the player, then that's a totally different license, which is slightly more expensive. The process of setting up renders, and I feel like we've touched on this before in other episodes when we've talked about just what goes into making an update, but it is very much, and maybe this is my bias as like a woman who grew up playing with Barbies and things like that, but I definitely feel like it's the same process as like a dollhouse. Like, first you create the environment, and you set the textures for the walls, and you bring in the furniture, and you make the furniture look the way you want it, and you get everything set up the way that you want it to look, and then you bring in the characters, and then you dress them and put their hair on, and sometimes I try to change their hairstyles around, which can get very tricky because I want it to be the same color, and that's sometimes tricky to make work in order to get those materials to match up or to look like it's a possible hairstyle for their hair. These are things that can be kind of tricky, but I have fun doing that because it reminds me of playing with Barbies, putting makeup on them, changing their nail color. These are all things that are, I think, kind of fun. There's some challenges involved in that. Not all clothes work great with all models. Big booba characters struggle. A lot of clothes are not made to morph around big booba characters. There's a setting called D-Force in DAZ, which is kind of like gravity. And some of the clothes require that. Some of them don't play nice without it. Some of them don't play nice with it. So I actually recorded some footage that I'm going to put as the backdrop for this episode. So you've probably already seen it at this point. But I had already pulled out this outfit for Delia to wear. And then come to find out when I brought her into the scene that the skirt does not play nice when she's sitting. And so I had to mess around with the settings in order to get it to work where she's sitting. And then it still had a lot of poke through of her legs in the back. So I could only show it from one angle, which was fine. But it just, I think it'll illustrate kind of what you can lose a lot of time doing in DAZ. But that said, I know people often talk about like, oh, if developers move to Blender, then things would be so much faster. And so, I think about what this setup process would look like with Blender. And I do think with Blender that the later stuff, like the posing and the lighting and even the rendering goes faster. But from what I understand, all of this setup stuff takes a lot longer in Blender because you're bringing in the assets from DAZ, because DAZ has so many assets and there's not really a lot of assets just already available for Blender that all kind of work together. So people are bringing in the assets from DAZ and into Blender, and they lose a lot of things like the textures and the morphs, and then bringing in the characters, they lose all their morphs and all their bones that are already set up in DAZ in order to pose them. And then from what I understand, bringing in hair and clothes from DAZ is very difficult because the clothes that are made for DAZ characters already have bones built into them that are supposed to mirror the bones of the character, which is where my kind of thing went wrong with Delia's skirt. Like the skirt did not bend with her legs, which in the way that it was supposed to. But, from what I understand, that's kind of like a given with Blender, is that you're going to spend a lot of time setting up all the things to have all the bones that they need to work together. And so you lose a lot of time on that end, is what I've heard. And you've messed around with Blender more, so you probably know more.
Yeah, I think I told you, several months ago that I did test it out and I tried like a bridge is what they call it. There's a couple ways to port it over, and at least the predominant bridge to do that for the port, like I brought Paloma over and the scene with her in like the hotel room, and yeah, it looked like a freaking nightmare. And just knowing that I was going to have to learn all the buttonology and all the other things that were going to have to come with that, and to improve the bridge to make it actually somehow look like our game as it does in the renders, it just seemed like a nightmare and was not going to be worth our time. So I called it off at that moment.
Yeah, so we've talked about, again, I know other developers feel differently, so I'm definitely not speaking for any other developers, but, there's a reason why most of us stick with DAZ, is just that it is the best tool. It's not always the greatest, it's not perfect. It has a lot of drawbacks, but all the other programs have drawbacks as well. And so it's just more about like, how many drawbacks are you willing to deal with, especially when it comes to a project where time is really of the essence. And I do think, in my opinion, even though I'm not like, I don't love DAZ, so don't get me wrong, I'm not over here like saying it's the best program in the entire world, but I just can't think of any program that's better as far as like ramping up quickly and getting something made. It's just really good at that. And that's what it's also really good at photorealism. Like that's, well, I don't want to say good in it and that it always achieves it, but that's what it's really optimized for, is for lifelike characters with a lot of geometry. Like the geometry of DAZ characters is extremely complex, and it does a really great job rendering them in a short period of time, all things considered. Whenever I see DAZ characters brought into Blender, they lose a lot of that geometry, and yeah, it renders faster, but they also are smoother, therefore, and they have less human-like detail, and you lose a lot of the texture of the skin and detail. So there's always trade-offs, right? So with Blender, obviously, from what I understand, the posing tools and especially animation tools are much faster, but you lose some of that like photorealistic geometry that DAZ is really good at rendering.
Yeah, I think, you already mentioned this, but to hammer it home, like DAZ is more beginner friendly, like you're saying. It's a faster ramp up time, as you were saying. So if you want to get into developing these games faster and you want a tool, like DAZ is probably going to be the one. You're still going to have to learn a shit ton. Don't get us wrong, but it's probably going to be less than Blender because Blender just has so much. It's massive. Right.
Yeah, Blender is really made, it's kind of like Photoshop, right? It's made to do a lot of different things. And so, you have a lot to learn if you want to kind of optimize it for whatever your specific use case is. DAZ is really made to do like one thing, which is to make these like still renders that look like they're from a movie or a TV show or like a photograph. Again, when I say photorealism, I'm not saying that everything that comes out of DAZ looks exactly like a real life photo, but just that that's what people are attempting with DAZ, and that's what it's made to do, is to make things that look like real human beings in like a film setting. And it's not necessarily as great at things like cartoon characters. Like, I've seen in Blender, people can make animations that look like Lego stop motion stuff. Like Daz would be terrible at that, right? But out of the box, Daz does a better job at just like real human characters doing real human things in real human environments. Like it's just really well set up for that. But when you try to go beyond that, or again, animation, it was never made from animation. That's kind of clearly something that was like tacked on after the fact. And so, I think you can get really good at it and make really amazing still renders, but it definitely is, not optimized for animation. And that's where Blender is better, but you kind of have to, pick one or the other.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say real quick too is if you do pick one, like we were talking about, like trying to port over to Blender and make things look samey with Daz renders, it's very difficult. So if you are going to do it, and just pick one from the very beginning and stick with it.
Yeah, pick one, yes, for sure.
So you can definitely make a game out of Blender. You can definitely make a game out of Unreal, like just renders, but just stick with it. Don't change midway through because you're going to encounter issues and consistency issues.
Yeah. And, again, not to call out other developers as in like to disparage them or anything like that, but obviously I think it's pretty well known in the industry. For example, Fresh Women used Daz for the first game and then they switched to Blender for the second game. And we know some people that, are work on that game and we definitely know their reasons for doing it. And again, their reasons for them were valid. Watching them for me was validation of like, this is why we didn't do it, but it doesn't mean it was the wrong choice for them. But, they gained a lot of functionality when it comes to animations for sure. And, but definitely lost a lot of time in like moving all the assets over and learning how to use the software. And so, everybody's going to do that calculus differently as far as like what's worth the time. But I agree. It's kind of, I think the best approach is to kind of pick one and stick with it. Trying to change midway or use both at the same time, that is going to be even harder than just, starting with one or the other and having to learn everything for it.
Right. And one quick side note for Blender is that can be a business move with it, especially if you start with it, is that you're going to have a much larger talent pool than with Daz. Daz is much more limited, is our understanding of it.
Right. But again, what I understand from the freshman example is that while you can find more people that have experience with Blender in general, very few, just like there's very few people that have good experience with Daz, there's very few people that are experienced at using Daz assets in Blender, which is a very specific skill and a very specific thing that you need to do in order to bring the assets over. And it's not a one-time thing to bring the assets over. Like every time you need a new character or a new environment or a new outfit or a new anything, like you're bringing everything over. So it is, an ongoing process. And that's a very specific skill that it sounds like they had to learn from scratch, which, once you've learned it all, then it seems like the workflow is very similar to Daz or even faster or better or whatever. And yes, Blender has things that Daz does not have, like soft body physics in order to make, soft body, like body parts react appropriately. Daz does not have any soft body physics. What both of them are not great at is liquid physics. So, these are all drawbacks that they have. There's other programs. I think Maya is supposed to be better at liquid physics, but is way more complicated and harder than even Daz or Blender. So yeah, there's a lot to consider. But for us, Daz has always been the top choice in that we came into this as complete beginners and, we were able to ramp up relatively quickly with Daz. I would like to work with Blender in the future, but for me, I don't ever see a world in which we bring Daz assets into Blender. Watching other developers do that has further confirmed for me that is just not the right choice for us. I'm glad it was the right choice for them, but it's just not the right choice for us. If we use Blender, it will be with customized assets made for Blender. And we've talked about how we probably want to use Unreal. So again, I would just use custom assets made for Unreal and not try to bring Daz models into Unreal, which we've also seen done with games like that
Breeders of Nephilim.
Yeah, no, that one does that one use Daz assets? I don't think it does.
No, it doesn't.
The one I'm thinking of is a VR. It's not a VR game, but it's like an interactive Home Together.
Okay,
yeah. That one is Daz assets, I believe, in Unreal.
Okay.
So
yeah. It looked great.
Yeah, it looks great. But from what I understand, they went through the same growing pains of like every time they have to bring something over, it's a huge
lot of hard work. Yeah.
Especially because that game is interactive. So, in terms of rendering, again, I feel like we've talked about it in other episodes, but the kind of workflow for me is that first I write the whole scene, and that way I have a really good picture of it in my mind of what it's going to look like, and then I just go through each line of dialogue and I make the renders that I need in order to to make the scene. And that's kind of the opposite of how we did things for Prince Suburbia. With Prince Suburbia, we would often commission the art before we wrote it. We had a good idea of what we wanted in the scene, but because, neither of us was the artist, we wanted to give the artist a little bit of leeway to inject their own artistic freedom. And so, if we had written the scene first, that might have provided them with more guidance, which is sometimes helpful. Sometimes people don't want to have to think of everything out from scratch. And certainly when they, either of our artists had questions like, well, what do you want for this or that? Where do you want them to be? If we had answers, we gave it to them. But, sometimes giving a professional freedom to do what they're best at results in much better work than if you were constraining them by like, well, we already wrote the scene, so it has to look like this. So we often had them do the art first, and then we would write the scene around it. And, again, collaborating the whole time as far as like, if there were specific details that needed to be changed as we got sketches and stuff, we would ask for that. But, the kind of benefit for me being the writer and the artist is that I'm already kind of making the art while I'm writing it in my mind. And then sometimes I do get into the program and something is not working out the way I thought it would, or just making it suddenly inspires me and gives me a new idea. But because I'm the writer and the artist, I literally will just sit down and write that new part like while I'm making the renders. And so, for me, it's a much more kind of, I function better when I think of everything ahead of time and do all that thinking before I sit down to make the renders. But yeah, it's like setting up dolls. You set up the room, the environment, whatever, you bring in the person, dress them, whatever, and then you have to pose them. And again, like I said, I took some like a video capture of the process. So, hopefully you can kind of see how the posing works, but, you have kind of sliders that you can use for posing. But you can also there's some like kind of, tools that you can also use to like pull on body parts and pose like with the actual mouse itself. And so a kind of mix of those. What I have, like, at first, what was confusing to me about Daz, but is now very innate, is how all the joints are connected to each other and, what joints inform future joints. And so, I don't know if that's just, like, basic anatomy stuff that maybe I didn't know because I'm not an artist. I think artists typically know more about anatomy than I realized. But I've definitely learned a lot about anatomy and which joints depend on the other joints. And it makes it, posing go a little bit faster, knowing, like, if I move this, it's going to move these, or I have to move this in order to move that. But, it's still a really tedious process and just to get things right, because what's possible isn't what's natural. So Daz does have limits on it as far as like, you can, for the most part, only do things that are possible with the musculature unless you turn the limits off. But just because something is possible does not mean it looks natural. And that's something that I've learned more over time, is to use real life references or use myself as a reference as far as like what is a natural way to do this, as opposed to like, okay, it's possible and it's achieving what I want to achieve, as opposed to natural. And that's something that I feel like is definitely like a long-term skill that I've had to learn over time. And I don't know if you want to talk about that as far as animations goes.
Yeah. So for animations, real quick, I just want to mention like there are other programs that are better at it, like Josselyn was mentioning, like with Blender, Unreal, like the jiggle physics, the animations, and are going to look better if people know what they're doing. That being said, like Daz still has a high ceiling if you know how to manipulate it. I'm not one of those people who can reach that high ceiling, at least not yet. I'm working on it slowly but surely, gradually. Some of the people, like we were talking about before with Project Passion, Classy Lemon, his animations are great. Another person is Jackerman. He's a 3D artist, animator, and he makes shorts and sometimes long form. But anyways, he stretches it to the limit too. There was another one too. Anyways, I forget. But anyways, the point is the ceiling is very high. It's just not as high as Blender or Unreal, but you can still do it. It's still workable. As far as the animation process goes, Josselyn goes pretty easy on me these days. She sets up the scenes for me and puts the characters in a general pose, and I just have to, I shouldn't say general pose, like a pose that would work, and then I manipulate it after I test some things with the moving of the joints and the various things, like bend the hip basically, and see what's going to work, what's going to look good, and then I make adjustments after the fact. It's been a process to learn all this stuff. It's a lot, and then you go through it, and essentially you decide, are you going to do really long animations? Are you going to do short animations? We decided for our game it makes sense to stick with the shorter animations that are loopable, and that way we can just kind of crank them out a little bit more and then set up different camera angles. That was Josselyn's idea. I give her credit for that, to essentially make the most out of each posed animation.
Yeah, which I think in the beginning, I think if you look in chapter 1 and to an extent in chapter 2, we had more longer animations that are not loopable. And yeah, over time, we felt like our time was better spent making really high quality but short loopable animations. And then as far as like posing them and showing them from multiple camera angles, again, this was something that early on, if you're only going to show, for example, like their heads, then all you really have to pose are their heads. And, so it seemed like you were saving time. Like, okay, well, I only have to pose their heads. And so I'm saving time by having to not pose the rest of the body. But I think what I've learned over time and what works for me is to spend a lot of time posing so that the entire bodies are really posed well and they're not, clipping or doing anything impossible or they look really natural. And, that's more complicated the more people you add in because they can clip with each other and things like that. But, I find that I'd rather set up a really nice pose that's really natural and spend maybe multiple hours setting up really good poses. And then, yes, taking pictures of that from multiple angles, which to some people might kind of feel like cheating. But, I think the thing is that there's all kinds of really cool camera angles that you can do, right? And if you think about in a movie or a show, they're typically showing the same scene from multiple camera angles, and the actors aren't usually moving a whole lot. They're relatively stable during that time. So I kind of looked at it like that. Like I'm keeping them relatively stable, but I'm showing them from multiple cool different angles. And so that way I'm getting more bang for my buck. And yeah, we kind of came to the same conclusion about animations. Like it's cool to see really long animations. And so we still, of course, we'll still do those occasionally, but we definitely get more bang for our buck if we just set up a really nice animation that looks great from multiple angles and then show it from multiple angles. It results in higher quality visuals, even if they're less varied.
Right. And then like Josselyn was saying, I do use the bone tool quite a bit to move by the joints to make sure that it does look more realistic and lifelike so that the things that are moving are the things that are supposed to be moving. And a big part of it too is I end up looking at references, whether it's from other games, other animations, or just straight up porn clips just to see what the jiggle physics are supposed to look like, what the movements are supposed to look like, that kind of stuff. So also related to that, I wanted to mention, I do think it's worth considering for us and maybe other people in the future, like mocap, motion capture, because I think that makes it as easy as possible potentially, because you get the animation you need right in that moment and everything is moving the way it's supposed to.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure it's not that simple.
Yeah. But whether or not we do that, we will not announce it.
We'll have to get like full body spandex. I mean, you have to wear like a weird spandex suit for that, don't
right,
you? With all kinds of dots on it.
Yeah. If we have the window open and somebody sees us with them on, be like, what the hell kind of shit are they doing in there?
I know, our neighbors already think we're crazy because I'm sure they hear lots of stuff when our windows are open.
Yep.
Yeah, and so something else I want to talk about with the rendering, like I said, and I know I've mentioned this multiple times, but just in case this is the only episode you listen to, one of my kind of biggest pet peeves about players or and fans is that I see them talking about like, oh, well, when XYZ Dev has a ton of money and they can have a render farm, then they're just going to crank them out. And I'm like, it just doesn't work that way because most of the time is spent posing. And if you know how to set up your renders well, which I've learned over time, and I've learned some really kind of interesting tricks that really changed my perspective. Like once I learned more from a technological standpoint, how renders are made and how it works, I was better able to create renders that can render really good images in like a, relatively short period of time. I certainly don't aim for like the shortest time possible because it's just not necessary. I can only pose so many renders in a day, and then those can almost always render before the next day when I need to render more renders because we can leave it rendering when we're not working on things. And so, or we're not working on that specific thing. So while we're sleeping or, in the evenings or on the weekends, like we can just leave things rendering. And then, there is a benefit to a certain extent of having at least, I would say, two machines, especially if you're two people, obviously, then two people can work at once. Or, somebody can be working on animations while the other person is working on renders. Or even if you're one person, if you have two machines, because you can't pose while something is rendering. So you could be posing the next set of renders while renders are rendering. But beyond that, like once we've talked about like, oh, should we get a third rig? And I'm like, it just wouldn't ever be used. Like we rarely have a time where both of our machines are rendering and we need to do something additional. It's, so far it hasn't been a huge issue. And, certainly animations can take a long time to render because they're like, 90 frames or whatever of stuff. But, or even 100, 180 frames. But all that said, like so far rendering time has not ever really been the problem. When we are like waiting for things to render at the end of an update, like I'll be honest, it's usually because we waited too long to pose them, right? That there was downtime where nothing was being posed and nothing was being rendered. Not so much that we were rendering the whole time and we're still rendering. It's more that like if you make an animation like a week before the update is supposed to come out, it may or may not be rendered in time. But it's not really the rendering speed that's the holdup. It's the posing and the setup. And so talking about that, one of the things that I learned let me talk more about what I started off doing with chapter 1. So I was making renders and I didn't really know much about technologically how this whole technology worked. Like I was just still learning from like a logistical standpoint, like how do you set up the scenes and pose them and actually make the renders. And what we came to find out, I would say maybe like 3 to 6 months in was that I had been rendering with my CPU for the most part, because I had made scenes where I didn't have enough VRAM in my GPU in order to like process the initial scene, because the way that DAZ works, and so I can't speak for any other rendering program and how it works, but with DAZ, you're setting it up with these kind of like very simplified version of the models. And again, I should have a video capture that kind of shows what it looks like when you're working on it. And you can kind of preview as you go and see like a preview of what that would look like, but you really don't know what it's going to look like, because even the preview is not the same level of quality as the actual render. You don't know what it's going to look like until it renders. So you're just kind of working with like a simplified version of everything. And so you can basically make a scene that's so complicated that you can still preview it, because the preview is not as high quality as the render itself. But when you go to render it, it's too much either textures or geometry or whatever for the GPU to initially process. The GPU, like as far as like rendering and like, what's it called when it like brings all the pixels together? Like it'll tell you like X percentage compiled, or not compiled, but it's like the convergence.
Yeah.
So like once it gets going, then it's just converging the pixels like one by one. And we've never had an issue from a GPU standpoint of handling that. Like that just goes at whatever speed it goes. If you have a worse GPU, it goes a little bit slower. If you have a better GPU, it goes a little bit faster. The actual convergence is not really the issue, but I guess there's a whole bunch of calculations that have to be done when the render sets up that has to do with like the geometry and the light bouncing off the geometry and then bouncing off and, all these things. So the more like the more geometry that there's, the more triangles or whatever that there are. Like, again, these super complex DAZ characters that have like, even their like little eyelid and eye lacrimal and stuff have like thousands of geometry points that light can bounce off of and stuff like that. So, the more characters there are in a scene, the more textures there are with lots of detail that the light has to bounce off of. All those calculations are done at the beginning, and then it converges after that. Well, that initial calculation is where GPUs can crap out. And so when developers talk about needing a better GPU, typically in our experience, what we've learned is that they're talking about the VRAM, right? They're talking about the CUDA cores. And, you can get each generation of GPU is going to render a little bit faster in terms of convergence. Like you have a 3090, I have a 3080. As far as rendering time, though, they're pretty similar. I think yours goes a tiny bit faster, but where yours shines because it has more VRAM is that it can do that initial calculation faster, and it can calculate more complicated scenes than my GPU can handle.
Right. A big part of that too is like when I'm moving like the posing and moving the camera around and all that kind of stuff, like mine seems to render faster inside of the program itself.
Yeah.
Not actually doing the rendering process. And yeah, I agree with you. I've seen what people have said also about the 4090, and the 4090 is not that much faster than the 3090 at straight up rendering. It's just, I'm sure it's a part of that process. And then also, like you were talking about, like the sheer amount of like character models you can have in the game or environment assets is going to be the biggest difference essentially.
Yeah. And I think that's where, so I have a 3080, which I've been using, and I'm still pretty happy with it. Occasionally I run into problems where like a scene has too many characters, and so I can't like do all those initial calculations. There's workarounds though. Like I can render one side of the scene with those characters and then render the other side and then put them together. Like it's that I've done a lot. If I have like a scene with a lot of characters, or like if there's a ton of textures, you can like reduce the textures. I think it just depends on each developer's like threshold for how like much they're willing to like sacrifice in the scene, which I think for us, like, I don't typically, so far I haven't really run into a scene where I'm like, I literally cannot accomplish this scene that I want to accomplish. Like I always find a way. But yeah, what was happening initially was that I was creating scenes that were too complex for it to do those initial calculations. And so it was falling back on the CPU. But the thing about DAZ is that if it falls back on the CPU to make those initial calculations, it will continue rendering with the CPU as opposed to like going back to the GPU, which I think is just probably a software like optimization issue with DAZ. And you can turn off like CPU so that it can't fall back on the CPU, but then your GPU needs to be able to handle all the calculations. And so, we found out like 3 to 6 months in that I had been mostly rendering with my CPU, and we burnt out the
water cooling.
Yeah, the water cooling. But we got that repaired, which was actually not that bad. And then ever since then, we haven't had an issue because my machine actually cools itself pretty well as far as the GPU. You have more problems with your GPU overheating.
Yeah, but that's mostly because it was put in a shitty case that has bad airflow.
Yeah, so these are all things that we just didn't know until we started doing it. But yeah, so far I see a lot of developers talking about like, or aspiring developers like, well, I can't do it until I can afford like a 4090. And it's like, I really think you can you can do a lot even with a 2000 series, as far as like, if that's all you can afford to start, or if that's what you already have, you can do a lot with that. And it's just a matter of being strategic as far as, being willing to sacrifice the detail in less important things so that you can, make it a manageable amount of calculations. And yeah, it'll render a little bit slower, but you can still make really great renders if you're just really strategic about how you use the GPU. You can still make great looking renders. If the renders look bad with a lesser GPU, it's just more that the developer is being too ambitious. But there's definitely ways to make great looking graphics with even the 2000 series.
Right. You could also use even the remote rendering farms that are online too as an option. It's going to be expensive, but still.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I learned too that really changed my rendering game was that I think maybe it was almost a year into using DAZ that I was just reading some random forum post about it, and probably on the DAZ 3D forums. And somebody explained something to me that I had never, well, not to me, but they were explaining to somebody else, and I read it, and it was like light bulb moment, which is that iRay, which is the technology in NVIDIA GPUs that DAZ specifically uses. And that's another thing too. I've seen occasionally an aspiring developer talk about how they bought a new GPU and it was not an NVIDIA GPU, and DAZ pretty much exclusively, right? It only works with NVIDIA. Yeah. And which is also what all the AI models use, is they're all using like NVIDIA's,
right?
Like they're like killing it.
Yeah. If you invested in NVIDIA quite some time ago, you would have been rich by now.
Yeah. But yeah, one of the things I learned about iRay, which is that the technology that it uses to render, is that it uses light, and it needs light in order to render. And, I think we've all seen, newbie developers that oversaturate their scenes with too bright lighting. And a lot of that I think is because, it does render better the more lighting you have. What nobody had ever really explained to me was how you can use like the tone mapping. It's much like a camera. The settings in DAZ really are very similar to like what like cameras, like it talks about aperture and lens and this and that. So if you really have to learn a little bit about like how video cameras work, how like still photography cameras work, how cinematography and photography work. Like those are all important skills that you need for DAZ, because that's exactly the language that's used in DAZ as well, which I still don't always understand. But once I learned more about how you can use settings like in a camera, which are also available in DAZ, to reduce the lighting of the scene, that improved my render time a lot. So I have renders from like chapter 1 that I tried to re-render because I wanted to re-render them with better render settings, but I can't even render them because they won't render in my GPU, because they were those ones that were being rendered on the CPU. But yeah, they weren't lit well enough. That was a big issue, is that they weren't lit well enough, and therefore it just added a ton of rendering time. Like it was taking 30, 40, sometimes an hour for those renders to render when they weren't even that complicated. And now, often I create renders that are very complicated, but still only take like 5 to 7 minutes to render. So I usually cut my renders off now at like half an hour, because by that point there's just not really any more that's no more good is gonna come of it. The pixels are as converged as they're going to get, essentially. But yeah, having the scenes really well lit and then using the like kind of photography principles to reduce the lighting of the scene was like game changing. And so if you're thinking to work in DAZ, definitely play around with lighting so that you learn about that. The other thing too is that I learned that in DAZ, you can make any figure in the scene an emissive, like you can make it a light source. And that's how a lot of devs light their scenes, and they use what they call ghost lights, where they make an object an emissive, so it's emitting light, but then they make the object itself invisible so you can't see it. So there's a light source that's technically impossible, because if it were real life, you would be able to see the light right there. And it does make for really cool lighting, in that it makes light that would never be possible in real life, but it's not the most efficient lighting. DAZ is not optimized to use that in the same way that it uses its native light sources like spotlights and things. That said, I've heard that the latest update of DAZ treats emissives the same as like spotlights and things like that in terms of how efficiently it calculates the lighting. But I refuse to update. As we were talking about, we still use, I think, 4.16. I think they're on like 4 point something.
They're at least on 4.2 something.
Yeah, 4.2 something. Yeah, 4.22 I think was the latest one.
Yeah.
I'm talking out of my ass, because I won't upgrade past 4.16, because it's too likely for things that you've already, like when you're still working on the same game, you're going to be opening up old scenes and things that you've already used before so that you can reuse them, and characters that you've used before. And if it broke any of those things, like I would be so upset. So, and I've heard things about it breaking lights and ghost lights, and the newest one breaks this one particular like brand or creator of a lot of hair assets called Out of Touch. And there's fixes for it, but still, it's just like when you're so pressed for time, like it's just not something that I want to deal with.
Yeah, there's just not enough incentive to do it.
Yeah.
At all.
And I've heard some people say that the newest update, that the scenes load faster. That's another thing that you lose a ton of time in with DAZ, is that to open a scene, it has to open all the morphs and all the textures and all the everything, and it just takes like frickin' forever. So if you, God forbid, need to go back and open an old scene, like you're going to lose 2-3 minutes, for me at least. And I know for some developers with lesser, CPUs, it can take like 7 to 10 minutes to open a scene. So you lose a lot of time with that, just can't be. But I've heard it's better at opening scenes and maybe even rendering, but I just wouldn't want to lose time anywhere else. So it's just not worth it. I already have my workflow.
As far as the technical stuff about rendering animations, I don't really have a whole lot to say with that, other than like you're just going to have to get into it. You're going to have to test things out. You're going to have to see what you like and what you don't like as far as the time frames go. What we've already said is, 2 or 3 seconds. That's kind of the sweet spot for us for the animations and what can look good as far as loopable stuff goes. You can definitely make loopable stuff past that kind of timeline, that amount of seconds. It's just going to require more rendering time and essentially more posing to make it look natural. The last thing I'll say about this is you're just going to have to get intimate with the keyframes as well. You're going to know keyframes pretty well by the end of this, and then what it takes to make things look realistic is you're moving body parts and using morphs, etc. in these kind of animations.
Yeah, and then we'll just briefly talk about what happens after you render. So we set up these things, we pose them. That's where most of the time is spent. Again, I have I think a 2-hour video that I captured. I'll probably speed it up, but I posed, I don't know, like handful of renders in that time, because it was early in the process. Once I get going, I can sometimes pose more than that, especially if there's not a huge variation between the renders. But and even the ones that I posed, I ended up having to go back and fix some things when they actually rendered. One of them, the lighting was wrong and all kinds of stuff. So even that 2 hours that I recorded, I probably spent another hour after that to actually get the final renders that'll be used in the game. And I don't know, it was like 4 renders or something. So yeah, it can be very time consuming. And then we leave them to render. There's these scripts that allow it to batch render and just render while you're doing other things. And then, after that, we do some post work on them. We use GIMP, which is a freeware kind of version of Photoshop, essentially. I know a lot of devs swear by Photoshop. I've just never used Photoshop, and we've been using GIMP. So it's not even like a cost thing at this point. It's just like, that's what we know how to use. But we do have some like filters and things that we do in GIMP afterwards. If I do have like little things like clipping and stuff that I can fix with GIMP, I will fix that. Although I've gotten much better at this point at being able to make renders that are just fine, like from the get-go, as opposed to having to fix a lot of things in post-work. But yeah, we apply some filters. We do some things to make the renders really pop, but we don't do a ton of post-work. I know some devs that have a lot of post-work. I try to do more of that in the application itself, as far as like the settings of the lighting and any other things like that. But some people do them after the fact. And then you have to do a little bit of post-work for the animations as well.
Yeah, so in the animating process for DAZ, what you do is you do still images for all the keyframes that you essentially created. You don't do the movie aspect because that doesn't work. And then if it crashes in the middle of the movie, well, you're kind of screwed. So what I do is I take the still images and I use a program called DaVinci Resolve to make the actual animation itself by putting all the still images together. Not saying it's a perfect program, but it's the one I use. And then after that, I take the completed animations and I use a program called Handbrake to make them all into WebMs instead of the movie file that's created, which is typically like an MP3 or an MKV, one of the two. And then after that, I put them into the game. Another interesting aspect that we kind of set ourselves apart from some of the other games out there. There's definitely some other games that do it, to be sure, or to be clear, but is including the blinks that we have in the game. That's such a nice touch, and it feels like you're looking at an animated scene, or at least partially animated, and it's very intimate, like when the female characters are looking into your eyes, or at least that's what it seems like in the renders, and then they're blinking at you. It's very cool. And then another aspect is like the dynamic images. You wanted to create, for example, like in the fight scene, like where the MC kind of loses himself a little bit, and then you have some images that kind of flash back and forth, and then you have to kind of figure out the timing of that to make it feel good, and then also adding sound effects later to really enhance the whole experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing, again, a misconception I often see is people talk about RenPy as if RenPy is the rendering engine, and to be clear, RenPy is a game engine, but it is not, unlike something like Unreal where you do both the images and the game in the same engine. RenPy is just a coding game engine. There's no visuals like included in RenPy. Any game that looks like ours is using DAZ to make the images themselves. But RenPy does have some features that allow you to make, what we call pseudo animations. The blinks, for example, are 3 images that are looped and then using like a dissolve in between them. So it does give more of the illusion of it being animated. Actually, I was just looking back at the Delia hypnosis scene from chapter 3 because I'm making the one for chapter 4. And we had a blink in there that's like a very slow blink that was 6 renders. And when I was watching it, I was like, it looks just like we had made it in like an actual animation, because by the time you had 6, frames and then the dissolve between them, like it really was an animation at that point. So you can make animations in RenPy. You certainly wouldn't want to take like those, 120 still images and make an animation out of them in RenPy, just because from a coding standpoint, it would take, it'd be a nightmare, but, it probably wouldn't be very optimized. But certainly you can use the features of RenPy to take still images and do some pretty creative things with them. And so as we've gone through the chapters, we've gotten more ambitious with that. And chapter 4 will have a lot more what we call pseudo animations where, there's just minor movements happening. And so we can put like a dissolve between them in RenPy and time them such that it gives more the illusion of an animation, not a full on, 60 frames per second animation kind of thing, but, it gives it a little bit more dynamism. And certainly that's something that we've always strived to do with the blinks. And then even just the characters, I try to move them slightly in between renders, even their whole body and things like that. So that, that it kind of gives more this illusion of movement. All those little things, RenPy certainly helps you kind of like, even though RenPy you don't create visuals in RenPy, it does have some tools that you can use to make the visuals better in your game for sure. Well, we hope that answered all your questions about how most adult visual novels, or I should say 3D adult visual novels, make their renders and animations in DAZ. Creating the art is probably the part of the development cycle that requires the most time and resources. And it's definitely the area too where I see the most misconceptions from players, because it is such a specific process with DAZ that I think does vary slightly from other artistic processes or hand-drawn art or Blender or Unreal. It's just a very specific program with very specific workflow. And, hopefully we shed some light on why the art takes so long. It's not necessarily the limitations of the program or hardware. It's just that I think art in any form takes a long time. Hand-drawn art takes a long time. Art in Blender takes a long time to make it look good. What you're spending your time on sometimes changes from program to program, but the reality is that high quality visuals is not something that you can cheat your way through, and no amount of like money or hardware is going to speed up the process of making really high quality visuals. And I think that's always very clear too with really high quality TV shows and movies, is that the ones that have the most high quality visuals are the ones that take the longest, and there's just no cheat code for that.
If there's anything else you wanted to know about the 3D rendering and animation process that we didn't answer, or if you have questions about any other topic you'd like us to discuss, let us know. We hope we plant some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye!